Picture a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier at sea. 90,000 tons of steel, a crew of 5,000, an air wing of 70 aircraft, nuclear reactors turning salt water into electricity around the clock. Now picture a second one, deployed simultaneously in a different ocean, 6,000 miles away. The United States Navy is doing exactly that right now. One carrier strike group operating in the Western Pacific, another covering the approaches to the Strait of Hormuz. 2 theaters, 2 commitments. The full weight of American naval deterrence stretched across both. And yet, somewhere inside the Pentagon, a senior Navy officer has put a date on a piece of paper, July, and warned that the service could run out of operating money before that month is out. Here is the paradox. The most powerful Navy ever assembled is fully deployed, visibly present, and operationally committed on 2 of the most consequential stretches of ocean on Earth. So how does a force that size hit a cash flow wall? The answer isn't about ships. It isn't about missiles or crews or readiness scores. It's about the math of sustained presence. And once you see the arithmetic, the warning stops sounding like an excuse and starts sounding like a precise engineering calculation. Stay with us, because the answer runs deeper than a budget line. It reaches into the economics of interception, the physics of carrier operations, the output of American shipyards, and a funding mechanism that was never designed to carry the weight being placed on it right now. To understand where the money goes, you have to understand what it means to keep a carrier strike group at sea. A Nimitz-class carrier, or its successor, the Gerald R. Ford-class, doesn't operate alone. Around it, the Navy assembles what it calls a carrier strike group. Typically 1 carrier, 1 or 2 Ticonderoga-class cruisers or Arleigh Burke-class destroyers acting as the Air Defense Corps. 2 to 3 additional Arleigh Burke destroyers for surface and anti-submarine warfare. A fast attack submarine running submerged in the group's vicinity, and a supply ship. That's 7 to 9 hulls moving in coordinated formation, every one of them burning fuel, cycling through maintenance, consuming spare parts, and paying out crew salaries and flight pay every single day. The air wing on that carrier, a mix of F/A-18 Super Hornets, F-35C Lightning IIs, E-2D Advanced Hawkeyes for airborne early warning, EA-18G Growlers for electronic attack, MH-60R Seahawk helicopters for anti-submarine work, flies daily sorties. Each flight hour on an F/A-18 Super Hornet costs the Navy around $10,000 when you factor in fuel, maintenance, and component wear. A full flight deck cycle burns through those hours fast. The daily operating cost for a single carrier strike group at sea runs into the millions. Estimates range from $6 to $10 million per day depending on operational tempo, sortie rate, and whether the group is actively conducting strike operations or just maintaining presence. Multiply that by the length of a deployment, typically 6 to 8 months. And a single deployment runs somewhere between $1 and $2 billion in operations and maintenance spending alone, before you count procurement, personnel overhead, or shore-based support. Now run 2 deployments simultaneously. The drain on the Navy's operations and maintenance accounts isn't double the peacetime baseline. It's significantly higher, because sustained high-tempo operations consume consumables, accelerate wear cycles, and trigger unscheduled maintenance at a rate that budget planners, working from historical averages, didn't fully account for when the fiscal year began. Here's what most people assume: that a military budget this large, the Navy's share of the defense budget runs around $250 billion annually when you include all accounts, should have enough slack to absorb any plausible operational surge. What that assumption misses is how the money is partitioned. The Navy's budget is divided into accounts: shipbuilding, aircraft procurement, research and development, personnel, and operations and maintenance. Those accounts aren't freely interchangeable. Money appropriated for shipbuilding can't legally be reprogrammed into fuel and spare parts without specific congressional authorization. The operations and maintenance account, the one that pays for steaming, flying, maintaining, and supplying the deployed fleet, is its own lane, and that lane has a ceiling. What's most surprising about this situation isn't that the Navy is running short on money. It's that the mechanism doing the damage isn't the deployment itself. It's the funding instrument that was supposed to cover the deployment while Congress worked out the full-year budget. That instrument is called a continuing resolution. When Congress fails to pass a full appropriations bill before the fiscal year begins, which has happened in most recent years, the federal government operates under a continuing resolution, or CR, which funds agencies at roughly the prior year's rate for a defined period. For the Navy, a continuing resolution is operationally toxic in a specific way. It locks the service into last year's spending rate, even when this year's operational commitments have expanded. If the Navy is now running 2 carrier strike groups at high tempo in theaters where last year it was running 1 at moderate tempo, the CR doesn't care. It dispenses money at the old rate while the operational clock ticks forward at the new one. The gap between what the continuing resolution provides and what 2 simultaneous high-tempo deployments actually cost accumulates week by week. By the time Congress passes a full-year appropriation, if it passes one at all before the fiscal year ends, the operations and maintenance account may already be in deficit territory, forcing the Navy to either reprogram money from other accounts with emergency authorization requests, draw down on working capital funds that then have to be replenished, or reduce operational tempo in one theater to preserve funding headroom in the other. Put yourself in the CNO's position for a moment. You have 2 theater commands making legitimate operational demands, combatant commanders who have assigned missions to your carrier groups, and an operations and maintenance account being drawn down faster than the continuing resolution refills it. The July warning isn't theater, it's arithmetic. But the CR is only one layer of the problem. The second layer sits 6,000 miles away, in the Strait of Hormuz, and it has a price tag attached to every single engagement. The Houthi campaign in the Red Sea and the broader threat environment around the Strait of Hormuz have placed American surface combatants in a sustained, active air defense role the Navy hasn't seen at this scale since the Second World War. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, ships like USS Carney, USS Mason, USS Gravely, have been intercepting one-way attack drones and anti-ship cruise missiles at a rate that would have seemed implausible in a planning scenario 5 years ago. The interceptor doing most of that work is the SM-6. The Standard Missile-6 is the Navy's primary long-range air and missile defense weapon, capable of engaging aircraft, cruise missiles, and ballistic missile re-entry vehicles at ranges exceeding 200 kilometers. It's also one of the most expensive rounds in the Navy's magazine. A single SM-6 costs approximately $4 million. The threat it's being used to intercept, a Shahed series one-way attack drone, the dominant threat in the Red Sea theater, costs its manufacturer somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000 per unit. That's an exchange ratio of roughly 80 to 1 in favor of the attacker. For every dollar the Houthis spend on a drone, the United States Navy spends somewhere between $80 and $200 on the interceptor. Here's the part that seems counterintuitive. This isn't a tactical failure. The SM-6 is doing its job. The Arleigh Burke destroyers are doing their job. The ships aren't being hit. But the economic logic of the campaign is running in exactly the wrong direction for the budget. Every successful interception is a small tactical victory and a measurable financial loss in the operations and maintenance account. The Phalanx CIWS, the close-in weapon system, the Gatling gun that fires 20mm rounds at 3,000 per minute as a last-ditch defense, costs roughly $60 per round. When Phalanx engages a drone that got through the outer defensive layer, the economics improve dramatically. But Phalanx only engages at close range, inside a kilometer, and the whole point of layered defense is to stop threats before they reach that envelope. The long-range work is done by SM-6 and its older cousin, the SM-2, and those rounds cost money that replenishes slowly. The Navy's SM-6 stockpile isn't a number that gets published in open sources, but the production rate of SM-6, built by Raytheon at a facility in Huntsville, Alabama, is well understood to be in the low hundreds per year. The service has been consuming rounds in the Red Sea theater at a pace that strains that production rate. And production capacity isn't something you expand overnight. The supply chain for an SM-6 involves precision components, specialized propellants, and seeker technology that takes years to bring online at higher volume. I spent time going through the public budget justification documents the Navy submits to Congress, and one line kept appearing in different forms across multiple fiscal years. The Navy has consistently requested more SM-6 procurement funding than Congress has appropriated. The gap between what the fleet needs and what the production line delivers has been visible in the budget for years. The Red Sea operations didn't create that gap. They made it impossible to ignore. So the money problem has 2 simultaneous engines driving it. The operating tempo of 2 carrier strike groups consuming the operations and maintenance account faster than a continuing resolution can refill it, and the interception campaign in the Hormuz theater consuming precision munitions faster than the production line can replace them. Either one of those pressures alone would be manageable. Together, they create the conditions for the July warning. But there's a third layer, and this one operates on a longer timescale. It's the layer that makes the budget pressure not just an immediate crisis, but a structural problem. And it shows up in the comparison between what American shipyards are producing and what Chinese shipyards are producing. The People's Liberation Army Navy has been adding warship tonnage at a rate with no historical precedent in the modern era outside of wartime. Chinese shipyards, state-owned enterprises operating under a national industrial strategy, have been launching destroyers, frigates, amphibious assault ships, and submarines at a pace that Western naval analysts track closely. The Type 055 destroyer, China's most capable surface combatant, displaces around 13,000 tons and carries a vertical launch system with 112 cells. Comparable in many respects to the Ticonderoga-class cruisers, the U.S. Navy is in the process of retiring. China has commissioned 8 Type 055s and has more under construction. The Chinese carrier Fujian, the Type 003, is equipped with electromagnetic catapults, making it the first non-American carrier with that capability. It represents a genuine generational advance in Chinese carrier aviation. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy is struggling to hold its fleet at the 300-hull goal it set years ago. The current battle force is around 290 ships, and the shipbuilding plan has been revised downward multiple times. American private shipyards. Huntington Ingalls Industries in Newport News and Pascagoula, General Dynamics Bath Iron Works in Maine, are operating at capacity, but that capacity is constrained by workforce shortages, supply chain bottlenecks, and the long training cycles required for skilled shipbuilders. The most uncomfortable math in American naval planning right now is this. China is adding warship tonnage faster than the United States, and the American operations and maintenance budget is consuming dollars that might otherwise fund new construction. Every day, a carrier strike group steams at high tempo in a forward theater. It burns money that could theoretically have gone into the next destroyer or the next submarine. The fleet is spending down its future to pay for its present. Here's a take that will probably get some pushback. The continuing resolution isn't just a congressional dysfunction story. It's a strategic weapons system deployed by whoever benefits from American military underinvestment. When the Navy can't plan a full fiscal year because Congress hasn't passed an appropriations bill, it can't sign long-term procurement contracts, can't lock in production rates, can't execute the shipbuilding program on schedule. The CR is the mechanism through which budgetary gridlock becomes fleet attrition, and it has been operating on that schedule for most of the last decade. The numbers are stark. In the last 15 fiscal years, the government has operated under at least one continuing resolution every single year. Full-year appropriations passed on time, before October 1st, the start of the fiscal year, have been the exception rather than the rule. For the Navy, this means program managers, contracting officers, and fleet commanders have been operating in persistent fiscal uncertainty that compounds over time. What strikes me about this pattern is that it isn't a failure of any single administration or Congress. It's a systemic output of a political environment in which budgetary brinksmanship has become normal. The ships, the crews, the technology. Exceptional. The funding process that supports them has become structurally unreliable. An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer costs approximately $2 billion to build and takes roughly 3 to 4 years to construct. When a continuing resolution delays the signing of a construction contract by 6 months, because the program can't commit to a multi-year deal under CR authority, the delivery date moves by at least that much, and often more when you account for production line disruption. The ship that should have joined the fleet in 2027 arrives in 2028 or later, and during that gap, the ships already in service carry the operational load at higher tempo, consuming their maintenance cycles faster. Now the loop closes. The carrier strike groups in the Pacific and at Hormuz aren't there by accident. They're there because the combatant commanders, Indo-Pacific Command and Central Command, have made the case that presence is deterrence, and that pulling back invites the kind of miscalculation that sustained presence is designed to prevent. In the Pacific, the logic is explicit. An adversary doing the arithmetic on a potential move against Taiwan or other contested geography in the South China Sea needs to account for American carrier aviation and the missile magazines of the Arleigh Burke destroyers in the theater. An F-35C Lightning II launching from a Ford-class carrier and an SM-6 ready in a vertical launch cell represent a level of kinetic cost that affects the calculation. Remove the carrier, and the calculus shifts. Pull the group back to its home port in San Diego or Norfolk, and the deterrence gap is visible to satellite reconnaissance within hours. In the Hormuz theater, the calculus is similar but operates on a shorter timescale. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and roughly 20% of the world's petroleum supply transits it. The presence of American surface combatants in the region, and the carrier aviation that backs them up, is the insurance policy against a closure that would spike oil prices globally and hit U.S. allies in Asia particularly hard. The problem the Navy faces is that both deterrence missions are real and legitimate, and both cost money at a rate the current funding structure can't sustain indefinitely. The fleet can't ease off one theater without a visible signal that the commitment is wavering. But holding both theaters at current tempo burns through the operations and maintenance account on the trajectory that produces the July warning. So what are the actual options? Fewer than you might think, and none of them are clean. Option 1. Pull tempo in one theater. Reduce the Hormuz commitment. Perhaps by cycling a carrier group out without replacing it immediately, relying more heavily on shore-based Air Force assets and allied navies to cover the gap. This preserves the operations and maintenance account but creates a visible deterrence gap in a theater where Iran's naval and missile forces have been active. The message that sends, not just to Tehran, but to Beijing, to Moscow, to every regional actor watching, is that American fiscal constraints have become operational constraints. Option 2. Hold tempo and force the funding fight. Keep both groups deployed, run the operations and maintenance account toward the July ceiling, and force Congress to pass an emergency supplemental appropriation or a full-year budget under political pressure. This isn't without precedent. Congress has passed emergency supplementals for military operations before, and the visibility of a senior officer's public warning is partly designed to create the political conditions for exactly that outcome. The risk is that the supplemental doesn't come in time or comes with conditions that constrain operational flexibility. Option 3. Reprogram. With presidential authorization, the Department of Defense can move money between accounts within certain limits. This has been used before. The Trump administration famously reprogrammed military construction funds for border barrier projects, and it's a legal mechanism for addressing short-term cash flow problems. But reprogramming has limits on amount and frequency, and it solves this year's problem while potentially creating next year's by raiding accounts that will need to be refilled. One detail that stayed with me when reviewing the Navy's supplemental requests over the past 3 years is how consistently the service has described its operations and maintenance accounts as at risk in the back half of fiscal years when continuing resolutions have been in effect. This isn't a new warning. It's a warning that has been delivered with increasing specificity. What's new is the public character of the July statement. The fact that the constraint is being named out loud, with a date attached, in a way clearly intended to reach a congressional audience. The deeper strategic cost, the one that doesn't show up in the operations and maintenance account because it accumulates over years rather than months, is the divergence between American and Chinese shipbuilding output. The U.S. Navy's 30-year shipbuilding plan has been revised downward in consecutive budget cycles. The goal of 355 ships, set formally in 2016 under the Force Structure Assessment, has never been funded at a level that would actually achieve it. The current trajectory projects a fleet staying in the range of 280 to 300 ships through the early 2030s, even as the PLA Navy's battle force grows past 300 and keeps expanding. The crossover, the moment when China's battle force numerically exceeds America's, has already occurred by some counting methodologies, and the trend line runs in one direction. Here's what this tells us about the broader picture. The United States is currently in a competition running on two simultaneous tracks. The operational track, keeping ships at sea, maintaining presence, deterring, consumes the operations and maintenance budget. The industrial track, building the future fleet, expanding production capacity, developing next-generation systems, competes for the same fiscal resources at the appropriations level. When the operational track runs hot, as it is now, it consumes dollars the industrial track needs. The fleet is spending its future to service its present, and the shipbuilding plan that would reverse the trend requires sustained, on-time appropriations that the political system has not been reliably delivering. The people paying the most immediate price for this are the sailors and aviators on those deployed ships. A carrier strike group deployment that runs longer than planned because relief is delayed, which happens when budget uncertainty disrupts scheduling, means sailors away from families for longer, maintenance intervals stretched, and training cycles disrupted. The F/A-18 Super Hornet pilots flying daily combat air patrols over the Red Sea approaches are accumulating flight hours at a rate that shortens the airframe's service life. The Arleigh Burke destroyers cycling through high-tempo operations in the Persian Gulf are hitting their maintenance windows with more deferred work than normal. Readiness isn't just about how many ships are in the water. It's about what condition those ships are in and what condition their crews are in. Would you rather be the planner who pulls one theater to save the budget and explains that decision to allies and adversaries, or the one who holds both theaters and calls the funding bluff? That isn't a rhetorical question. Defense analysts and combatant commanders have different answers, and the disagreement is real. Drop your answer in the comments, because the strategic math here is genuinely contested. Here is where the paradox resolves, and where the deeper problem becomes visible. The Nimitz-class carrier at sea isn't constrained by ships. The United States Navy has 11 nuclear-powered carriers, more than every other navy combined. It isn't constrained by crews, or by the capability of its F-35Cs, or by the reach of its SM-6 interceptors. It's constrained by the structural mismatch between what sustained two-theater presence costs and what the current funding mechanism delivers. The dollar figure, not the hull, is the binding limit. The July warning is the sound of that mismatch becoming audible. A service that can put 90,000-ton nuclear carriers in two oceans simultaneously can still run up against a cash flow ceiling imposed by a continuing resolution. Not because the Navy is wasteful or mismanaged, but because the mechanism that funds it was designed for a world where operational tempo was lower and the fiscal calendar was more predictable. Neither of those conditions holds today. The fleet can ease off one theater to stretch dollars, preserving the budget at the cost of a visible deterrence gap. Or it can hold presence everywhere and force the funding fight, betting that Congress and the administration will move before July rather than after. Each path has a cost in deterrence or readiness, and the choice between them is ultimately a political one, not a military one. What the budget math actually forces, regardless of which option is chosen, is a reckoning with the industrial question. Temporary supplementals can fix this year's operations and maintenance shortfall. They can't fix the shipbuilding gap. They can't accelerate the SM-6 production line by next quarter. They can't add a new dry dock at Huntington Ingalls or train a new generation of shipbuilders in time to matter in the current planning cycle. The fiscal problem is immediate, the industrial problem is structural, and the two of them are running simultaneously on different clocks. If the United States wants to hold two theaters without hitting a July wall every fiscal year, the answer isn't a supplemental appropriation. It's a sustained, on-time, adequately sized appropriation for both operations and shipbuilding, delivered through a budget process that has not reliably produced that outcome in over a decade. That's the real constraint. Not the carriers, not the crews, not the missiles. The money. Comment yes or no. Does the Navy hold both theaters through July, or does something give first? We'll be watching the comments. And if you want to go deeper on how the SM-6 production shortage is reshaping Pacific deterrence planning, that breakdown is up next.